Welcome to the Read Talk Podcast, the podcast designed to bring information, read-making tips, and lightheartedness to your read desk. Each podcast features a leading oboist in our field and does a deep dive into a question on every oboist's mind. How do I become a more successful reed maker? Joining us today is John Ferrillo, principal oboist of the Boston Symphony and oboe faculty at the New England Conservatory and Boston University. Let's talk reeds. I'm Courtney Miller.
And I'm Margaret Marco.
Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your expertise on reed making. We want to start this interview off with the nuts and bolts of reed making. Can you tell us about your setup?
I play Luray oboes, and for many years I've been playing B-series oboes. They are ones that John Seimer and I have refurbished. We made studies of B-series Lurays. Now, those are oboes, I would say, roughly from the mid-50s into the 60s, and were the first post-war sort of beefed up, heavier models than the A-series oboes were, slightly thicker walled and made to play in a way that was a little broader, including in the upper register, in the modern orchestra. Mm-hmm. And I've been playing those for at least 25 years now. I have, by the way, worked with Luray on producing something we call a B copy, which copies a lot of the qualities of those old B-series. And of course, I'm very much into setting up gougers. I use very traditional techniques, although I use computer numerical control for making the components of the gouging machines in hopes of making them in a more consistent way. For shapes, I use a Gilbert 1 shape, what nowadays might be called wider shapes, but over the history of shapes of the last 100 years, is sort of a medium width, which is to say a Gilbert 1, but an older Gilbert 1, the ones that John Mack, I believe, had some hand in designing in the early 70s, that have changed a good deal since the turn of the century, since in the last 20 years. Being of sort of a medium width, they have to be tied from 73.5 to 74 millimeters long. And I've always been used to having a longer blank and making a slightly longer reed. My finished reed length is 71.5. It used to be 72, but now I play in a 441 orchestra, so I make them a little bit longer. By the way, that is the length that John Mack recommended back in the early 70s when he was using that shape. The disadvantage of extremely narrow shapes that many people have been using is that they have to tie them scarcely longer than a finished reed length. And I think that's really forced people to use reeds that are, in fact, much shorter than they might opt to do if they were in complete control of the process. And the length of that reed really affects your ability to play in the upper register. I really think that 71 millimeters and up is very good for having a nice solid side octave notes. The bigger point is, if you want to make a shorter reed, you should make a shorter reed, but you shouldn't make a shorter reed just because you can't tie a longer blank. So that is one reason that I advocate for a medium width shape that's tied longer. Does that make sense?
It does. It absolutely does. So you're not at the mercy of the shaper tip.
Right, and so it doesn't put you into too tight a corner.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In fact, I have friends that use narrow shapes that make their reeds about the same length I do, but they're forced to make them with no extra runway, so to speak. And I just find it much easier to clip off excess than to have absolutely no leeway.
What type of staples do you prefer or do you use on your setup?
I have a 50-year-old mandrel that I first got when I was 13 years old. And I used it for years and years, and found that as the years went by, gradually the only tube that really fit it beautifully were Glotin. Now, by the way, I also found over the years that my dear friend Linda Stroman, my mandrel was unmarked. Linda's mandrel was stamped Luray. And in fact, those two are incredibly close mates and about the same age. And not only do they fit largely the same tubes, but they have the same, sort of finial at the end of the mandrel and same shape to the handle itself, and clearly made by the same person. And I was visiting Lotin, and lo and behold, they said, "Oh, we recognize this." And they went back into their drawer of Neolithic mandrels and pulled out something that in fact was identical. So these are, in fact, tubes similar to the ones that I started on 50 years ago. Now, over those years, as we got into the late 70s and early 80s, when oboe bores got bigger, Luray began to make bigger tubes. And I tended to hew to the same size tube. I just found the sound and pitch characteristics changed too much to me. So I was constantly looking for smaller tubes back then. Then in the late 80s, of course, with the AK oboes, oboe bores got much smaller again, and the tubes got smaller. And then my problem was finding ones that were big enough. So the answer for me were Glotin tubes. And I've forged a very nice friendship with the Naranters, who are the proprietors now of Glotin. And we've worked together, and I'm very happy with that collaboration. Now, I should say that the strength of them is again, moderate-sized opening. The tendency, particularly in the 90s and the early thousands, was for tubes to get very small and quite round. Many oboists say when they see a small opening on a tube, oh, well, that must mean they're more focused. But as oboists know, when the bore of an oboe in the top joint becomes very, very small, you have trouble, particularly in the upper register, with things being sort of flat and choked. It doesn't focus them more. It actually makes them saggier. So when they get oversized, then they get noisier and sharper, particularly in the left-hand notes in the upper register. So, reed making, like a lot of things in life, is a search for a middle ground where you avoid side effects. That doesn't matter whether it's oboes, tubes, shapers, gougers. You always try to hew to a middle ground, but, with some flexibility. If you see a trend going in one direction, then you can alter another factor to counterbalance it. But if anything gets too out of whack in one direction, thick, thin, wide, narrow, whatever that is, you get into unavoidable side effects. So to know historically where oboes and tubes and these things have been is important to know when you're on middle ground. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Do you have any records or measurements of tubes? I know you're very detail-oriented.
In terms of exact sizes of apertures, I could not give you that, no. I use 47 millimeter tubes. I can tell you that Tabito, as well as both my teachers, John Delancey and John Mack, used to file 0.5 millimeter off the bottom. They felt that made the upper register more comfortable for them. I just find that when I get shorter than 47 millimeters, I find that I can't blow against that upper register notes in a way that I like. Most phrases soar up into the upper register, and you need to be able, for me, I need to be able to blow against those notes and know they will hold together. And I think maybe Richard Woodhams has done that too, by the way, just filing off the bottom about 0.5 millimeter. And they thought that was a good compromise between the 47 and the 46.
Interesting.
So, now that's getting pretty geeky, isn't it? I hope there are no clarinetists or flutists listening.
Oh, we've scared the clarinets and flutes away. Don't worry. We've done good work. So you've kind of answered this a little bit, but who are some of your reed-making mentors, and what did you learn from each of them?
Well, one of the things that worries me in the current generation of oboe players, I can now start sounding since I'm officially of that age, namely 39 and a half.
Oh, exactly.
But I will tell you that I've been 39 and a half for 25 and a half years. And one of my worries is, it's a very curious thing, but looking back on my teacher's generation, a lot of young oboists draw themselves up into camps and say, well, this person meant these characteristics and those meant those. I will tell you that if you listen to, the great playing of John Mack or John Delancey or Robert Bloom or Mark Lifshee, these are close cousins. Particularly compared to the present, I find that styles are once again sort of spreading out a bit again. And, my teacher, John Delancey, had enormous respect for his peers. It was a very interesting thing. I never, ever heard him speak ill. Never. Of a peer. He might say, well, they're a little bit obsessive. This one's a little nutty about the oboe, but fine player. I never heard him say anything other than that. And they were very complimentary. Now, John Delancey was my teacher at Curtis, and my first Curtis school teacher. So in other words, I went to Curtis. It was a really different experience. And then in my mid-20s to late 20s, I had a lot of contact with John Mack, and I found these two things very complementary. When I was a student with John Delancey, he told me exactly what a reed should do, and a great deal about the prioritizing of the function, looking for this first and that second and that third. And he preached very much making a reed by crow. Now, what he didn't do is he didn't get into, make it this thick and that wide and use this gouge, and he didn't get into those particulars. His feeling was that the important thing is that you know exactly what that reed should do. And of course, it was matched with very thorough training in the Barrett book. Those Barrett melodies, that look sort of simple, but are in fact are very difficult to play with complete musical integrity. And the combination of the two and long tones and things like that really meant you had to get your reeds to behave. Then I went to see John Mack. I think I was probably 23, and I was a teacher at Illinois State. And John Mack was the great details man. He would tell you the how-tos of things. And basically, he was one of the most important people for teaching me what a gouge should do. And some very critical things about reed making. For instance, this is very geeky, but he really changed the way I look at the transition into the tip. Before I bumped into him, I used to make quite a smooth transition, and my tip, in fact, was something that was graduated down to the corners. John Mack was the person that taught me that the tip should be another plateau, that I should be thinking more of the tip as all of one thickness, roughly. So in other words, he was teaching better definition of that tip, and he was teaching me that the back of the tip was a way to get elevation of pitch, particularly in the upper register, but still with depth. And it was quite a revelation. I am who I am because of both of these great, great teachers. And Delancey was maybe more the big picture person, and John Mack more the one catching details. But by the time I got to John Mack, it was the details I needed work on. By the way, that wasn't just reeds. John Mack would have resented deeply if I'd suggested that it was just reeds. I wouldn't have from him. He was a great musical coach. He taught me things about articulation and vibrato, but I refused to pick between these men. They were both giants. They were both incredibly convincing players. And by the way, I watched both of them sit down. John Delancey once, in his last week or two, I played assistant and second to him in his last month in the Philly Orchestra. And in a Saratoga Springs rehearsal, about 30 minutes before a rehearsal of a big piece, it might have been Shostakovich 5 or something like that. So in other words, the orchestra was gathering around, and he said, I'm going to show you something. And he took out this little reed case, and in it were 3 blanks. And he took out a blank, and he said, I'm going to play the tuning note on this reed. Now, not only was he making the reed by the crow, but you couldn't really hear it easily. He was making it by the feel of the crow. Now, of course, at that moment, I was, 22? Well, yeah, but teach me some real details. By gum, in the